I think just like fund investing is democratization of finance, social media is democratization of communication. And it's an opportunity not only for you, the CEO, to speak, it's also an opportunity for other members of your organization to be able to speak. And so it's important to view this not as an individual task, but as an organizational one.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, Eric Pan. Eric J. Pan is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Investment Company Institute, the leading association representing regulated investment funds. Here are a few things I think that you should know about Eric. Number one, he was previously a senior U.S. government official involved in setting standards in the financial services industry. Eric served as the director of the Office of International Affairs at the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission and head of international regulatory policy at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He represented both market regulators and international standard-setting bodies, including the International Organization of Securities Commissions and Financial Stability Board, and also in regulatory dialogues with European and Asian counterparts. So Eric has been a top representative of the U.S. government when it comes to these matters. Number two, before entering government service, Pan was the director of the Heyman Center on Corporate Governance and a professor at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York, where he wrote extensively about financial regulation and corporate law. He also practiced corporate and international law with Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. And if that's not enough, he was a senior research fellow at the Center for Law and Economic Studies at Columbia Law School in New York. Third thing I want you to know is that under Eric's leadership, ICI has been at the forefront of communicating with policymakers and the public by launching a new public-facing campaign called Secure Financial Future, as well as executing a digital strategy to ensure the industry's message reaches the right people at the right time. Eric, you have been called many things, from law professor and government regulator to a foremost expert on investment fund regulation and, of course, CEO. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, I want to start with, a big milestone. Your industry just celebrated a 100th birthday, and I even saw a social media post with a mouthwatering birthday cake to celebrate that. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Why is that milestone so important? Why did you want to make sure folks knew about it?
Well, it's like any major birthday, it's a chance to kind of look back and see how far we've come. So this is the 100th anniversary of the Humble Mutual Fund. And it's funny because today, millions of Americans use mutual funds. In fact, mutual funds is sort of something people have. What I think a lot of Americans need to know that 100 years ago, someone came up with the idea with the mutual fund. And it was actually originally in Boston, Massachusetts, and the first mutual fund by MFS. And this really was this remarkable invention that's helped so many American families. In many ways, it's probably been one of the most important financial innovations in modern finance that has led to average Americans being able to accumulate a great deal of wealth by participating in the capital markets. So the fact that it's been 100 years was something that we couldn't let the birthday go without being noticed. And it also opens up a conversation about how people should invest today?
You know, Eric, when you talk about mutual funds, I think back to when I was in high school and I had my first job at a grocery store. And I started accumulating a little bit of savings and said, what should I do with this? And my parents and the teller at the bank inside the grocery store said, you can buy mutual funds. And at that point in time, I mean, it was not an option. I didn't know anything about stocks to pick a company. Although looking back, maybe there are a few. If I had had a crystal ball, I would have wished I had bought. But I didn't know about that. I didn't know about a lot of things that didn't exist back then, right? I don't think ETFs were a big thing yet, and certainly there wasn't crypto. So mutual funds was this like solid choice. And that's how I got started. And I feel like it's a very strong brand that people understand. But now there are a lot of other acronyms and things out there. And I guess part of what you have to do is help people, lots of different stakeholders, understand why the mutual fund is such an important cornerstone of investing. So can you kind of talk about that from a standpoint of communicating with, I mean, you have to get your message out to people like when I was that high school kid looking to start my first investment, as well as senators and members of Congress and folks in the White House and more and more. So I'd love to hear how you sort of adapt your message across all of those different stakeholder groups that you have to reach.
So you've put your finger right on, I think, the hardest part of the job. Finance is not something people want to spend a lot of time thinking about. Most people, they want to play with their kids, they want to do their hobbies, they want to go out to eat, they want to enjoy life. And try to engage people in a conversation about finance is really hard to do. It's a bit like brushing your teeth. It's something people know they need to think about because making sure you have financial security is so important today. But it's not something people enjoy talking about or enjoy thinking about. It's very technical. There are a lot of acronyms, a lot of jargon. It seems really complex. In talking about mutual funds and your story about your first job and being told to invest in mutual funds is exactly why we wanted to begin with mutual funds. Today, the mutual fund is merely one of many different investment fund products people can use. There are things called ETFs today. There are target date funds. There are closed-end funds. There are collective investment trusts. I mean, the list can go on. But because people have heard about mutual funds, we often want to begin the conversation with something that they have some familiarity with. And that's why we talk about mutual funds. It's accessible. People understand it. It's something that I think is very intuitive. And once we get people to talk about mutual funds, then we can also then introduce these other products. And they have a basis to understand what these other products do. So that's really kind of been our strategy. I think whenever you try to communicate a complex technical topic, you try to first start off with something that people do understand. And then you say, okay, well, I think we all can understand this first concept. And then you start adding complexity, adding technical detail, and people are able to follow what you're saying. So that's been our strategy when we talk about mutual funds.
It makes a lot of sense. Start with something a little bit simpler and then layer onto it. Something you said a moment ago is you said people don't like talking about finance. And I had to chuckle a little bit because I said, well, most people don't, but you do. This is something that you've worked in a long time. And I wonder if you could talk about, as you had this major milestone and as you're having to break through the noise and get the message out, how do you translate your own enthusiasm and excitement, because this is something that, I mean, you are excited about and that you are an expert in, out to people, the rest of the folks that you were referring to who don't necessarily care about this topic?
Well, I think with any topic where people have a strong interest, you have to be genuine. It is an area that I have spent a lot of my career thinking about. I've worked at as a regulator. I now work here at ICI. So yes, I am really interested in this topic. I find it fascinating. I think it's really important. But you begin with recognizing that not everyone thinks the way I think. Not everyone shares my enthusiasm for the topic. So how do we get them to pick up on the enthusiasm? And I think part of it is by being very genuine, by kind of explaining why this is a really interesting topic. But I think it's also, I think this is a challenge with any area where there are experts and there are kind of people new to an area. You can't talk down to people. Just because they're not familiar with an area doesn't mean that they're not as smart. It doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to understand. Is talking to your audiences with respect and actually saying, hey, this is something I think that you would find really interesting too. And let me explain to you why I find it interesting. And that's really kind of something that we've been trying to do at ICI. You mentioned things like updating videos that we did from the 1950s. You talk about some of our social media posts. All of them are designed to say, hey, we understand that you have other interests. We understand that this is not an area that you've been thinking about, but we think it's really important, and we think that it's something you would enjoy knowing about. So let's make it fun. Let's make it accessible. Let's make it not a technical topic. Let's talk to you in plain language, because if you give us a shot in trying to understand this area, we think you too will get really enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, it occurs to me that you've really honed that approach in roles outside of, I mean, right now you're basically the chief lobbyist for the industry, but you aren't a trained lobbyist. You were a teacher for so long, and that you've really honed that expertise a little bit as a teacher. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, because that's certainly a unique perspective that you bring to this role that not many folks have done.
So I think it's been an experience that's been quite formative in my career. I was a law professor, and I still do teach today. I'm an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School. And sometimes people ask me, why? Why are you still doing this? And it's because, as someone who has taught students, I actually find it to be amazingly important and humbling. Students are not always the easiest audience. They especially today, they're on their laptops. They could be surfing the internet. They could be shopping. They don't always have to be listening to you. And to develop the skill of conveying why they should care about a subject. So that goes to your previous question of how do you get non-experts to be interested in what you're interested in? Communicating in a clear fashion, because attention spans are really short, even in a classroom. Students don't give you an hour to convince them that they should care. They're going to listen until they get bored. Is how do you get to the point? How do you make it relevant to them? How do you get them to be personally committed to the subject? And also, how do you take a topic where it can be extremely complex, but boil it down to simple concepts, right? And these are all skills that I think successful teachers have developed. It's a skill that I wouldn't go so far to say that I'm a successful teacher, but it's a skill that I've tried to develop while in the classroom. And I've really tried to apply those lessons to what we do today, as a trade association, because I think it's exactly the same challenge. Whether it's just a conversation in a meeting, or talking to a policymaker, or being in a formal hearing, it's all the same thing, which you're trying to teach. You're trying to teach someone your viewpoint on an issue and get them to agree with you.
When you're teaching, it occurs to me, sometimes people come in and they maybe don't know a lot about something. And so you're sort of introducing new information. In other cases, people come in and they think they know something, but they have misconceptions. And so you have to sort of redirect them. And I wonder, what are some of the misconceptions that you run into? I mean, whether it's from whether it's law students who are focused on finance, but maybe I'm thinking policymakers and the public. What are some of the misconceptions that you have to confront and then redirect?
So I think that's a great question, because any audience, whether it be policymakers, regulators, people in the industry, or just the general public, everyone already has some viewpoint. You rarely meet somebody who has no opinion, right? So everybody has an opinion coming into the conversation. And again, drawing upon my teaching experience, you're not going to convince them by saying, you're wrong. I'm right, you're wrong. That is not how you convince somebody. You convince somebody by saying, I understand that you have a perspective. Okay. I would like to understand what your perspective is, but let me give you a different perspective and let me explain to you where my perspective comes from. And that means it could be provide data. So maybe the person has a perspective, but it's not supported by the data. So you show them the data. Maybe they have a perspective because they have an assumption as to how something works, but it's not consistent with how you see things working. Well, walk them through the basis for how things work. But it all comes down to respect, right? I think it's really important in any conversation is to recognize that everyone has a viewpoint, and in their minds, it's a valid viewpoint. And even if you drastically disagree with them, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't recognize that they have a reason for believing what they believe. Okay. And you need to meet them on their ground in order to get them to think differently. So that's, I think, I don't want to speak in a theoretical way, but that's sort of what you need to do in every conversation. And sometimes you have, it's the famous, you got your elevator time, right? Maybe you only have 30 seconds to do it. Maybe you have an hour to do it. And so you have to also adjust your style depending on the circumstances and the environment you're in. And that's really, really hard to do. But I think it's also what makes the job so interesting.
It occurs to me as you shared that, one of the things we've heard from some of our other chief influencers that I think you really echoed is that we have to know when to speak to the head and when to speak to the heart. And so you talked about data. Sometimes that's the way that somebody might be looking at the world. And so you need to be able to bring that data to them and really speak in a logical way. But sometimes somebody might have an assumption or a personal anecdote. And so maybe there's more of an emotional reaction there. And you have to be able to tell stories and find ways to connect there, because no level of data might convince that person if they already, have that deeply held belief. Do you sort of find that balance between speaking to the head and speaking to the heart is one of the things that you have to do across your communications, whether you're meeting with policy people in person or whether you're creating content to distribute out?
I think definitely, and often, switching between the head and the heart is actually a successful advocacy strategy. If I could give you an example, right? When we talk about mutual funds or the use of investment funds, especially in a place like Washington, where there are a lot of policy people, a lot of economists, you could quickly get into a conversation where everybody is a statistic and talk about what is the average income of the American family that owns mutual funds? How much money do they have in the mutual fund market? What's the number that you need in order to retire successfully? You could have that type of conversation, and everybody's a number, and we can throw out 100,000, $1 million, right? All these figures. But the fact of the matter is, those conversations often fail to consider the human element. And to be able to insert into the conversation a real life example or to recount a story can suddenly turn what is a very clinical, very technical conversation. And it kind of reminds everybody that actually real people are at stake. So a story that I love talking about, and it comes from one of our members, is when we talk about mutual funds, is one of our members got a phone call from a retired, she was a retired New York City public school teacher. So she's now, I think, probably well over 70 years old, deep in retirement. And she said, the only reason I can retire today is because of my mutual fund. And she talks about how she owns two mutual funds that were actually started by her own mother, who owned these mutual funds when her mother was an employee of the old Sears Roebuck company. And she has a wonderful statement that she makes, which is, I've learned that in order to retire successfully, you don't need lots of money. You just need time to invest. Now, of course, not everybody's like this woman. Not everyone had the same circumstances as her, but she, in a very simple way, completely makes all the conversations about retirement numbers and size of funds irrelevant, right? Because she has put now a human element to this whole point of why is it that we want to make it possible for people to invest. And I find kind of, we could talk about this as a mind conversation versus a heart conversation. I think the answer is it has to be both. You have to you have to be able to talk to both the heart and the mind. It's not a choice. It is actually something that you have to do all the time.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. One of the things you all have done, and you kind of alluded to it, is you tried to create, obviously you're having a lot of conversations like on Capitol Hill, but you're creating content that you can put on your website, put on your social media, send to people so that you can get that message out more broadly. And I love this story. It's so unique that you all had this video from over 50 years ago that you produced. I believe it was played in movie theaters before movies. And you and your team decided, there'd be an opportunity to update that video. Can you talk a little bit about maybe, obviously you weren't there when the first video was created, but give folks a little bit more background on what that was, why you decided to do this, and most importantly, why that's an ingredient that you decided was part of your recipe to influence others?
So I think it begins first with how people get information today, right? I have kids who are teenagers. I'm part of the generation that was probably the first generation where the internet was something that we lived with. But I also am old enough to still remember life before the internet. And I think the point is we get information today very differently than we did a generation or two generations ago, right? It's often not one authoritative source. It's not the person on the evening news who tells you what goes on. It is multiple people. It's influencers. It could be social media personalities. It could be formal publications like newspapers still. But the point is we have a lot more choices. And I think it also has changed politics in a way because members of Congress who are trying to be responsive to their constituents also know that they're going to hear from their constituents in many different ways. So recognizing this, we here at ICI realized that we needed to view our audience not just being the people here in Washington, but also the people who Washington listens to. As an industry that's focused on making sure that American families can retire, we needed to talk to American families. And we needed to find channels that allowed American families to be able to tell us what's important to them. So that when we have conversations with members of Congress, we can say, we've talked to American families. We know this is what they're worried about. We know this is what they want. And therefore, this is what you, member of Congress, should want too. Now, this decision to go and think about social media and digital tools as a way of trying to have this conversation, and it's a conversation. I want to emphasize this. Social media is not a tool for us to talk to American families. It's also a tool for us to hear from American families. So it's got to be interactive. Well, let's go back to how do we get American families to even start thinking about us? And when we looked at the archives and we saw that in the late 50s, ICI did put out this film loop that was really an introduction to mutual fund investing. And you're right, it did appear in movie theaters and it actually won some film awards at the time. It's this really short animated movie. We said, this is great because even though the film today would definitely looks like something that was created in the 50s, the concept is still true today, which is, hey, if we updated this movie, it actually could live on YouTube and it can live on social media. And it's a wonderful way of getting these new American families, just like their predecessors, to become familiar with fund investing. And it opens up the door to then having this conversation. So we've updated the video. It's on our website, but it's really meant to be a conversation starter. And we're very, very much interested in looking for other avenues to do this as well.
Something that's so important that I heard you say there is, you said it in a few different ways, influence is not just about pushing information out, but you have to listen. It's not just talking to people, it's hearing what those people have to say. And I think that element, that influence is a two-way street, is so important. And I love the examples that you're giving about how you do that, because you're not just saying it in theory, but you're showing sort of how you have created those avenues for communication to go in both directions, so that, in your case, you can say we've heard from American families, and you can authentically bring that information back and adjust what you're doing based on it and bring that story back to policymakers. So I love that. That is such a great takeaway. And I think as we talk about social media, I want to talk a little bit about your social media, because a lot of CEOs say they're too busy to spend time themselves on social media. But I've noticed that you are quite active on LinkedIn. And in fact, members of your team have told me that they know that you pay attention to the platform because they don't just see posts going out, but they post something and they see that you liked it. So they know, that, okay, he's seeing this stuff, and it allows that other layer of communication. So can you talk about your experience with social media and specifically LinkedIn?
I think we have to start off first with, I'm not somebody who is naturally active on social media, right? I've made the intentional effort to be active on social media because I realized that in my role, it's really important for people to hear directly from me and not have my words or my positions be interpreted by someone else, right? I don't want a reporter to be the one telling people, though, this is what Eric Pan or ICI thinks. I also feel it's really important to have greater control over what I think people should know about. So the posts that I put forward, or some of my interactions with other people's posts, are efforts by me to communicate to people as to, hey, there is a really important point that I think people should know about whatever topic we're talking about. It could be about how people save. It could be about our retirement system. It could be about how funds are regulated. But it's a chance for me to highlight what I think is a really important observation or an argument that I think people should consider. But I would also say that LinkedIn is only one form of social media. So, I think you're being very kind to me when you say things about my social media presence, because I'm also thinking to myself, well, I recognize that LinkedIn really kind of attracts a certain type of the population, tends to be more focused on business professionals. And I'm always talking to my team about, well, should we be thinking about being more active on other social media platforms? And let me just finish there about thinking about my earlier point that we in our industry really are here to work for American investors. And who that American investor is is also changing. So if I think about my own kids, they are the future of the American investor. And if they're on Instagram and they're on, other social media platforms, well, maybe we need to move the conversation to those channels because we need to be able to talk to them too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously you got to reach different people on different platforms. But one of the things that I've seen is that LinkedIn in particular is a platform that's really focused on people. And so, sometimes if I meet with the CEO, what I find is if a TV station calls, they will move mountains to say yes to that interview, and they may ignore their digital channels. And I think when it comes to LinkedIn, LinkedIn is kind of like that TV hit where you can't send your logo to be on TV. You got to send a person. And on LinkedIn, you really have to have people share content and show up to be effective. And I wonder, having been on the regulator side, you're meeting with regulators, you're meeting with policymakers. Do you think there are cases where those influential people might see something on LinkedIn from you on a day that you weren't able to be there with them in person, but you're still able to influence them through that channel?
I think definitely. I look, when I was a regulator, regulators did not spend a lot of time on social media. Um, I actually started my personal LinkedIn account back when I was a law professor, so before I became a regulator. And I think that I was one of the first ones to do so. I don't think too many regulators saw the need to be on social media. I do think that's changed. And I think it's changed not because regulators have changed, but I also think the types of people who are regulators have changed, right? They're younger, they're they come from different professional backgrounds, and they've kind of moved into this space, being used to being active on fora like LinkedIn, and have recognized that for regulators, it's a really important channel for them to communicate their own work, but also to collect information. So I definitely think that regulators and policymakers are more active on these social media channels. I think that they see what other people post. Um, and I think that's a trend that will only improve over time.
It occurs to me, having been a professor, and you're probably connected to people on LinkedIn. They might have been one of your law students, or it might have been a peer and a regulator. And now it might be somebody that, for a professional reason, you'd like to know it's the 100th anniversary of the mutual fund or of something else. And they're connected to you in that platform. And it's a way to get the information to the right people.
Oh, definitely. I think I'm sure that someday in the future there will be academics who spend all their time, maybe they already do, talking about how social media channels kind of build social networks. I mean, to your point, when I first joined LinkedIn, my initial connections, of course, were not people related to the funds industry. They were not people in government. Some of them were former students. Some of them were kind of alumni from the law school. Some were just people that I had met, and they've remained connections. And I am sure that now it's 2024 and they still see my posts. I have no idea if they're like, Eric is now posting about topics that I had no idea that he was working on before. I would like to think that some of them are saying, oh, this is kind of interesting. Now I'm learning something, or I'm actually kind of intrigued by what Eric is doing now, 12, 14 years later from when we first connected. I think that's really fascinating. It's the idea that social media connections, they rarely disappear, right? They may go cold, but they never disappear completely. We always have these strands of connections. And as we go through life, we kind of bring this network with us as we change professionally over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you just one last question on this topic. So your peers, other CEOs who might be thinking about this, but sort of have objections. Their objections might be, I don't have time, or I don't want to seem too self-promotional. What do you say to another CEO who might have those objections to being active on a platform like LinkedIn?
What I would say to them is, you know, this this is how we communicate today, right? Having a social media presence to your, like, you asked the question, is it self-promotional? Having a social media presence is not about making sure the spotlight is on you. Having a social media presence today, in my opinion, is saying that you have a voice on an important topic, that you have an opinion. And what I would say to other CEOs is, one of the most important jobs of any CEO, whether or not you're a CEO of a trade association or of a corporation, is communication. Um, Telling people what you think, what you believe in, telling people what your strategy is, telling people what you stand for, right? These are core concepts that every successful CEO needs to carry out, right? So think about visionary CEOs like a Steve Jobs, for example, right? Steve Jobs was more than he made great computers. He also had a philosophy about what a great computer is. He had a view as to what the user experience should be. You need to be able to communicate this. And social media, like LinkedIn, is a great way of doing so. So instead of viewing it as it's all about attention seeking or viewing it as something that's a hassle, I would instead view it as it's actually a really important part of your job.
Yeah, and something I observed with you, Eric, is that um, while you might share what you're doing and the industry is doing, you also use it as a platform to share the stage with others and colleagues. Celebrate them, comment on their, and I think that that's an important element too for folks that are thinking about getting into this. If you say, well, I don't want to be posting about myself all the time. Well, you don't have to post about yourself all the time because you can post about other people, and that's something I observed that you do.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that's the thing. It's also, I think just like fund investing is democratization of finance, social media is democratization of communication. And it's an opportunity not only for you, the CEO, to speak, it's also an opportunity for other members of your organization to be able to speak. And so it's important to view this not as an individual task, but as an organizational one.
That's really well said. As we come to the end here, I want to ask you, we discussed earlier on, you just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the mutual fund. And I want to know, what do you see for the next 100 years of your industry?
So think about how far we've come in 100 years. The next 100 years are going to be super exciting because the purpose of our industry remains core. And that purpose is, how do we get American families to be able to invest long term to ensure that they have financial security? And that could be if you're a young couple because you're thinking about buying a home. If you're parents, it could be because you're thinking one day that your kids are going to need to go to university and it's going to be really expensive. If you just started your job, it could be because you're already thinking about one day I'd like to retire and I want to retire comfortably, just like that New York City public school teacher. So the challenge, the goal will remain universal. Just as it did for the past 100 years, it will continue to be. But what's exciting is you're going to have new ways of doing so. You're going to have new types of investment products. If you think about how technology is going to, technological change will continue. We're already talking about things like artificial intelligence. That's all going to naturally lead to more ways for people to invest successfully, both in terms of opportunities to invest, like what is going to be the next Apple computer, okay, or the next NVIDIA, as well as how we invest. What are the tools we're going to use? What are the types of investment products that we're going to use? So it's going to be a really exciting next 100 years. So I think it's the combination of the need to invest will remain incredibly, incredibly strong. That's not going away. But the tools and the methods of investing will become so much more powerful. And this to me is really exciting. And this is why it's a space everyone should watch. Everyone will need to watch. And I'm really excited to be kind of part of this story in the role that I'm in today at ICI.
Your enthusiasm comes through, and it's such an important piece of the communication. And I think, hey, maybe in 50 years there will be another video riffing on the original and the new one that you made, or maybe it will be some sort of metaverse experience that we will all be in. But it doesn't. It seems like the story has a long way to go.
Who knows?
So
it could be a virtual. It could be a virtual experience, and you can watch it on Mars.
Yeah, on Mars, exactly. Well, Eric, this was a really great conversation. Some takeaways for me were one, I love what you said about just like funds democratize finance, that social media democratizes communication, and that you really have to look at it from a team perspective. And there's a role for the CEO to play, and you talked about how you do that, but also to get other team members and the brands involved. I also really was nodding along vigorously when you talked about the two-way nature of influence, that we can't just influence others, we have to let them influence us, and that's such an important part of the process. And then I think hearing kind of how you speak to both the head and the heart, whether you're talking to policymakers, law students, or families sitting around a kitchen table thinking about these things, that really resonated with me too. And I think it's a good reminder for all of us. So I just want to say thank you, Eric Pan, CEO of the Investment Company Institute. And we congratulate you for being recognized as a chief influencer, which I think everyone who hears this will understand why we've decided to do that. We're grateful for the time you spent with us today.
Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about this really important topic.
Absolutely. And we will link to the videos, of course, so folks can see them. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a chief influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.